January 17, 1943. Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The iron gates swung open with a slow, deliberate groan that seemed to echo across the frozen New England landscape. A column of German prisoners shuffled forward through the snow, their breath forming pale clouds in the bitter morning air. Their uniforms, once pristine Wehrmacht gray, hung loose and stained with the dirt of North African battlefields, the salt of Atlantic crossings, the sweat of defeat. Each man kept his eyes fixed on the ground ahead, unwilling to meet the gaze of the American sentries who flanked them on either side. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a strangely domestic smell that seemed impossibly distant from the war they had left behind. These were soldiers of the Afrika Korps, men who had believed themselves invincible under Rommel's command, until the sands of Tunisia swallowed their dreams of victory. They had been taught to expect barbarism in capture, conditioned by years of propaganda to anticipate the worst depravities that enemy hands could devise. The loudspeakers in Berlin had painted vivid pictures of American savagery, tales of prisoners worked to death, starved systematically, beaten without mercy. As their boots crunched through the Massachusetts snow, every man among them carried the weight of these expectations like stones in their pockets. They had steeled themselves for suffering. They had made peace with brutality. What they had not prepared for, what no amount of ideology or indoctrination could have readied them to face, was kindness. The story of how America treated its German prisoners during the Second World War stands as one of history's most remarkable contradictions. While the Reich systematically murdered millions, while Japanese camps reduced Allied soldiers to skeletons, the United States maintained a standard of captivity that seemed almost paradoxical in its humanity. This was not mercy born of weakness, nor was it naive idealism disconnected from the realities of total war. It was something more complex, more deliberate, a calculated demonstration of the very values that separated democracy from fascism, abundance from deprivation, freedom from tyranny. The prisoners who passed through American gates expected to find their propaganda confirmed. Instead, they encountered something their worldview had not accounted for: a nation so secure in its power, so confident in its principles, that it could afford to treat even its enemies with dignity. The numbers tell one part of the story. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States held over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war on American soil, the vast majority of them German. They were housed in more than 500 camps scattered across the country, from the pine forests of Maine to the deserts of Arizona, from Texas cattle country to the farmlands of Wisconsin. These were not the death camps of occupied Europe, nor the hellish stockades of the Pacific Theater. They were facilities built according to the Geneva Conventions, inspected regularly by the International Red Cross, and operated with a level of care that seemed incomprehensible to men raised under totalitarian rule. The death rate among German POWs in American custody stood at less than 1%, a figure so low it bordered on the peacetime mortality rate for young men. For comparison, nearly 40% of Soviet prisoners died in German camps, while American and British POWs in Japanese custody perished at rates exceeding 30%. But statistics alone cannot capture the profound psychological impact of this treatment. The prisoners who arrived at places like Fort Devens or Camp Concordia in Kansas, or the sprawling compounds of Camp Hearn in Texas, came bearing the accumulated weight of Nazi ideology. They had been told that Americans were mongrel people, racially inferior, spiritually corrupt, incapable of military discipline or genuine strength. They had been assured that American society, built as it was on capitalism and democracy, represented the weakest form of human organization, destined to crumble under the pressure of true Aryan will. These beliefs were not casually held opinions but foundational pillars of their identity as soldiers of the Reich. And then they stepped through those gates and encountered reality. The first shock came with the food. At Fort de Vennes that January morning, as the new arrivals were processed through intake, they were given their first American meal: coffee with real cream, white bread with butter, fried eggs, bacon, and sliced oranges that seemed impossibly bright against the gray morning. One prisoner, a 23-year-old Jeff Raider named Hans Weber, who had survived on ersatz coffee and black bread for months before his capture, would later write in his diary that he thought the Americans were fattening them up for some cruel purpose, that such abundance could not be routine. Another man, Ernst Floater, who had been captured at Kasserine Pass, recorded his disbelief at being offered seconds, then thirds. "I ate until I felt sick," he wrote years later. "Not because the food was bad, but because I could not remember the last time there had been enough." This was not an isolated experience. Across every American POW camp, German prisoners encountered meal portions that exceeded even what many American civilians received. The U.S. Army maintained that prisoners should be fed the same rations as American troops, a policy that seemed wasteful to some critics, but was rooted in both strategic calculation and genuine principle. The daily caloric intake for German POWs averaged between 2,500 and 3,000 calories, more than most German civilians received at home, significantly more than prisoners in German camps received, and incomprehensibly more than the starvation rations meted out in concentration camps. There was fresh meat several times a week, vegetables, bread baked daily in camp kitchens, real coffee, and periodic treats like ice cream or chocolate that seemed to come from some fantasy of American plenty. The prisoners struggled to reconcile this reality with everything they had been taught. Karl-Heinz Richter, captured in Tunisia and sent to a camp in Oklahoma, later recalled his first Sunday dinner in American custody: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, apple pie. "I thought it was Christmas," he said in an interview decades after the war. "Then I learned it was ordinary Sunday dinner, that this was normal. I began to understand that everything we had been told was a lie, not just some things, not just exaggerations, but fundamental lies about who these people were." But food was merely the most immediate symbol of a larger truth these prisoners were forced to confront. The camps themselves defied every expectation of captivity. They were not the filthy, overcrowded pens of Nazi imagination, but orderly compounds with barracks that had heat in winter, electric lights, indoor plumbing. There were recreational facilities, soccer fields, volleyball courts, sometimes even swimming pools constructed by the prisoners themselves with American materials and tools. Libraries stocked with books in German, musical instruments provided for those who wanted to form orchestras or bands, art supplies for painters, materials for craftsmen. Some camps established their own theaters where prisoners could perform plays and comedies. Others had newspapers printed by the prisoners, educational programs, even university-level courses taught by educated POWs to their fellow captives. The camp at Concordia, Kansas, became famous among prisoners for its treatment of inmates. Located in the wheat belt of Middle America, it held thousands of German soldiers who worked on local farms during harvest season. The prisoners were paid in scrip they could use at the camp canteen to buy candy, cigarettes, toiletries, even small luxury items. They were allowed to send letters home through the Red Cross, to receive packages, to maintain some thread of connection to the lives they had left behind. Hans Lammersdorf, who spent 2 years at Concordia, described his time there as the most well-fed, the most rested, and the most safe I had been since the war began. He spoke of American guards who learned German phrases to communicate better, of local families who would wave to the prisoners as they rode in trucks to the work sites, of a profound cognitive dissonance between the monsters he had expected and the ordinary people he encountered. This ordinariness became its own form of ideological weapon. The prisoners were not isolated from American society, but rather placed within it, allowed to observe it, to interact with it in controlled but meaningful ways. They saw American towns that were not bombed, stores with goods in the windows, children who were not starving, women who moved freely without fear. They worked alongside American farmers who owned their own land, who made casual remarks about disagreeing with government policy without fear of midnight arrests, who seemed to embody a kind of practical freedom that the prisoners had never conceptualized. These observations accumulated like water against a dam, each small instance of American normalcy pressing against the elaborate structure of Nazi ideology until cracks began to form. The contrast with what these men knew of captivity in German hands made the cognitive dissonance even more acute. Many of the prisoners had witnessed or participated in the brutal treatment of Soviet POWs on the Eastern Front, where starvation, exposure, and casual execution were routine. They had heard rumors, some had seen evidence, of the systematic murder of Jews and other undesirables throughout occupied Europe. They understood, even if they refused to fully acknowledge it, that the regime they served treated human life as expendable raw material in service of ideological purity. And yet here, in the heart of the enemy nation, they were given medical care when they fell ill, dental work when they had toothaches, religious services on Sundays for those who wanted them. The medical treatment, in particular, struck many prisoners as inexplicable. American camp doctors treated German POWs with the same standards of care afforded to American soldiers. Men with chronic conditions received ongoing treatment. Surgeries were performed when necessary. Dental work was provided not just for emergencies but for routine care. One prisoner, a former school teacher named Wilhelm Schneider, fractured his leg during a work assignment. He was taken to a civilian hospital, operated on by an American surgeon, and given a course of physical therapy to ensure proper healing. "The doctor spoke to me kindly," Schneider wrote. "He explained the procedure, asked about my pain level, treated me as though I were human. This was not supposed to be possible." The why of this treatment became a subject of endless discussion among the prisoners themselves. In the barracks at night, men would debate whether it was weakness or strength, naivety or calculation. Some, particularly the hardened Nazis among them, insisted it proved American softness, a lack of will to do what was necessary in total war. But even these voices grew quieter as the months passed, as the evidence mounted, as the war news from Europe brought reports of Germany's cities bombed to rubble, while the prisoners in America ate 3 meals a day and played soccer in their leisure time. The more perceptive among them began to grasp a different truth, that America could afford this generosity precisely because it was winning, that the capacity to treat prisoners well was itself a demonstration of overwhelming power. There was also a deliberate program beneath the surface of this seemingly benign captivity. The American military understood that these prisoners represented potential assets in the post-war world, that a German soldier who experienced decent treatment might become a voice for democracy when he returned home. The Special Projects Division oversaw re-education programs in many camps, providing prisoners with access to uncensored information, with newspapers that reported truthfully on the war's progress, with films and lectures that presented democratic principles without overt propaganda. It was a subtle campaign, designed not to break the prisoners but to plant seeds of doubt, to create cognitive dissonance that might flower into changed perspectives. Some prisoners resisted this program fiercely. Hardcore Nazis maintained their own rigid hierarchies within the camps, intimidating or even attacking prisoners who showed too much friendliness toward Americans, who questioned the Führer, who admitted that perhaps everything they had been told was not entirely accurate. There were incidents of violence, secret courts that judged and punished traitors, attempts to maintain ideological purity even in captivity. But these efforts grew increasingly desperate as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, as news filtered in of Germany's cities destroyed, of armies in retreat, of the final collapse of the thousand-year Reich into rubble and defeat. For many prisoners, the turning point came not through overt persuasion, but through sustained exposure to American abundance. The symbolic power of that abundance, manifested in every meal, every piece of new clothing issued, every camp facility maintained and improved, worked on the consciousness in ways that arguments could not. Friedrich Müller, a corporal captured in Italy, later described his gradual conversion. At first I thought they were trying to trick us to make us weak. Then I thought they were simply stupid, wasting resources on prisoners. But slowly I began to understand. They had so much that they could afford to give some to us. The propaganda had told us America was weak and poor, that it was held together only by Jewish bankers and Negro slaves. But here was evidence, undeniable evidence, that we had been lied to about everything. The recurring symbol in these prisoners' testimonies, appearing again and again in letters and diaries and post-war interviews, was the orange. Fresh fruit, especially citrus, had become nearly mythical in wartime Germany, a luxury so distant that many younger soldiers had only childhood memories of it. In American camps, oranges appeared regularly, not as special treats but as ordinary components of meals, sometimes several times a week. The prisoners would hold these bright orbs, would peel them slowly, would savor each segment with a mixture of pleasure and confusion. How could a nation at war, fighting on multiple continents, still have oranges for prisoners? The question gnawed at them, because the answer undermined everything they had been taught about American weakness, about the inevitable triumph of the Aryan will, about the superiority of their cause. The work programs added another layer to this ideological confusion. Under the Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war could be required to work, provided the labor was not directly related to military operations. The United States put its German POWs to work throughout the country, addressing severe labor shortages in agriculture and other industries. Prisoners picked cotton in the South, harvested wheat in the Midwest, cut timber in the Northwest, worked in canneries and food processing plants. They were paid nominal wages, 80 cents per day in scrip, and worked under conditions that, while certainly labor, bore no resemblance to the slave labor being extracted from prisoners and camp inmates in Germany. The farmers and businessmen who employed these POW work crews became inadvertent ambassadors of American values. Many prisoners later recalled specific interactions: a farmer's wife who brought lemonade to the fields on hot days, a foreman who explained the concept of labor unions, a shop owner who spoke proudly of his immigrant father and what America had allowed their family to build. These were not calculated ideological lessons, but simply the ordinary expressions of American life, and they had profound impacts. The prisoners saw wealth that was distributed broadly if unevenly, opportunity that seemed genuinely available to those who worked for it, a casual disrespect for rigid hierarchy that both shocked and secretly appealed to young men who had spent their lives being shouted at by officers. Some prisoners formed lasting bonds with Americans they encountered. At Camp Camo in Mississippi, a German POW named Georg Gettner worked on a local farm and became close to the farmer's family. He learned about their lives, their concerns, their hopes for their children. He saw how they debated politics at the dinner table, actual disagreement about government policy, expressed openly without fear. When the farmer discovered that Gettner had been a baker before the war, he arranged for him to bake bread for the farm workers, paying him extra scrip from his own pocket. These acts of simple human kindness, repeated across hundreds of camps and thousands of interactions, created hairline fractures in ideological certainty. As the war in Europe approached its climax, the prisoners in America lived in a strange twilight zone, insulated from the horrors consuming their homeland. They learned of Dresden's firebombing, of Berlin besieged, of Germany cut in half and squeezed between advancing armies. They received letters from home, those who still could, describing starvation, chaos, the collapse of everything familiar. And they sat in American camps, eating regular meals, sleeping in heated barracks, playing cards in the evening, listening to the radio broadcasts that made Germany's defeat more obvious with each passing week. The guilt some felt was profound, a survivor's shame at being comfortable while their families suffered. But mixed with that guilt was a growing realization that the suffering at home was not the result of American brutality, but of the war their own government had chosen to wage, the apocalyptic vision that had led Germany into this catastrophe. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brought new complications. The prisoners in America learned of the Reich's total collapse, of Hitler's suicide, of the revelation of the concentration camps, and the full scope of Nazi crimes. The re-education programs intensified, showing prisoners films of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, forcing them to confront the reality of what had been done in their nation's name. Some refused to believe, insisting the films were fabricated propaganda. Others were shattered by the evidence, forced to reckon with the fact that they had served, however tangentially, a regime of unprecedented evil. The camps became spaces of intense psychological struggle as men tried to process the gap between what they had believed and what had actually been true. Repatriation began slowly. The prisoners had to be screened, classified by their level of Nazi indoctrination, prepared for return to a Germany that no longer existed as they remembered it. Many, especially those who had been treated well in America, expressed reluctance to return. They had seen a different way of organizing society, experienced a different relationship between citizen and state, tasted abundance that made their homeland's deprivation seem less inevitable and more the result of specific political choices. Some requested to stay in America, though few were granted that wish in the immediate post-war period. Most returned to occupied Germany, carrying with them memories and experiences that would shape the nation's reconstruction. The long-term effects of this treatment rippled through German society in ways difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The hundreds of thousands of former POWs who returned from America brought with them stories that contradicted the bitter narratives of victimization many Germans told themselves. They had evidence, personal embodied evidence, that democracy was not weak, that abundance was not a myth, that the values America claimed to represent were not entirely hollow propaganda. In the ruins of Germany's cities, in the chaos of occupation and reconstruction, these memories became seeds of a different political imagination. Some former prisoners became active proponents of German democratization, drawing explicitly on their experiences in American camps. They spoke at public forums, wrote articles, engaged in the political debates that shaped West Germany's emergence. Others influenced more quietly, through conversations with family and neighbors, through the business practices they adopted, through the way they raised their children. The Ami culture that developed in post-war West Germany, a fascination with American music, films, consumer goods, and democratic ideals, was fed in part by these returned prisoners who had seen America firsthand and found it surprisingly appealing. Karl-Heinz Richter, the former prisoner who had been so struck by that Sunday chicken dinner in Oklahoma, became a school teacher in the new Federal Republic. He made it part of his personal mission to teach his students about the complexity of the war, about the importance of critical thinking, about the dangers of believing propaganda without question. "I tell them about the oranges," he said in a 1980 interview. "I tell them how we were taught that Americans were subhuman, and then we discovered they gave oranges to prisoners. Small thing, yes, but it contained a universe of meaning. It taught me to question everything, to look at evidence, to never again accept simple stories about who was good and who was evil." Not every former prisoner underwent such transformation, of course. Some returned to Germany still clutching fragments of Nazi ideology, bitter about defeat, unwilling to acknowledge that perhaps their cause had not been as righteous as they had believed. The human capacity for rationalization and denial is profound, and many men found ways to wall off their American experiences from their core beliefs, to treat those years as an aberration rather than a revelation. But even these men carried something back with them. The undeniable memory of how they had been treated, the living proof that the enemy they had been taught to despise had shown them a humanity their own regime had denied to millions. The American treatment of German POWs stands as a remarkable example of how values can be demonstrated through actions rather than words. It was not perfect. There were instances of poor treatment, moments when camp conditions failed to meet standards, racial hierarchies that complicated the picture considerably. African American guards often treated German prisoners who were, paradoxically, sometimes given better treatment and more freedom than Black American citizens in the same regions. This ugly irony was not lost on the prisoners themselves, some of whom noted the contradictions in their diaries and letters. The America they experienced was powerful and generous, yes, but it was also deeply flawed, marked by racial injustices that undermined its claimed principles. Yet even accounting for these contradictions, the overall treatment represented something significant, a national decision to uphold certain standards even when dealing with captured enemies, to recognize the humanity of soldiers who had fought for an ideology built on denying humanity to millions. It was a practical demonstration of the difference between totalitarianism and democracy, between a system that treated people as disposable resources and one that recognized, however imperfectly, the inherent worth of individual human beings. The symbolic power of this treatment extended beyond the immediate historical moment. It became part of the foundational mythology of the American-German postwar relationship, a story told to explain how former enemies became allies, how Germany transformed from fascist dictatorship to stable democracy. The narrative of German prisoners well treated in American camps fit neatly into a larger story about American exceptionalism, about the redemptive power of democratic values, about the possibility of political transformation. Like all such narratives, it simplified a far more complex reality, but it contained enough truth to resonate, to shape how both nations understood their shared history. For the prisoners themselves, those years in American camps represented an education that no school could have provided. They learned about abundance, about the material foundations of political freedom, about the connection between economic prosperity and social stability. They learned that strength could express itself through generosity rather than brutality, that power could be demonstrated through restraint rather than cruelty.
They learned, perhaps most importantly, that the propaganda they had absorbed was not merely exaggerated but fundamentally inverted, that the nation they had been taught to despise as weak and corrupt was in fact powerful and principled enough to treat even its enemies with the dignity their own regime had never shown to anyone it considered other. April 1946, a transport ship in New York Harbor. The war was over. The prisoners were going home. They stood on the deck in the gray spring morning, these thousands of German soldiers preparing to return to a homeland many had not seen in years, a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. They carried duffel bags packed with belongings, letters from families that had survived, documentation of their captivity. Some carried other things, two seeds of doubt about everything they had believed, memories of kindness from people they had been taught to hate, the taste of oranges in winter, the sound of American laughter, the strange experience of being treated as human by those who had every reason to treat them as monsters. The Statue of Liberty stood in the harbor, her torch raised against the clouded sky. Many of the prisoners looked at her as the ship prepared to depart. This symbol they had been taught represented false promises and hollow ideals. Some, surely, still believed that propaganda. But others, how many? Impossible to say, looked at that statue with new eyes, with the knowledge that the abundance and freedom she supposedly represented were not entirely mythical, that they had experienced something in America that challenged everything they thought they knew about power and weakness, about democracy and dictatorship, about what human beings owed to one another even in the midst of total war. The ship pulled away from the dock, turned toward the Atlantic, began the journey back to a ruined Germany that would have to be rebuilt from rubble and shame. And in the minds of these former prisoners, another kind of rebuilding had already begun, reconstruction of understanding, of worldview, of possibility. They had come to America expecting to confirm their darkest propaganda. Instead, they had discovered something more dangerous to ideology than any military defeat. evidence that an alternative was possible, that nations could be organized around principles other than might and blood, that strength could express itself through mercy rather than cruelty. The oranges they had eaten, their soccer games they had played, the medical care they had received. The Americans they had met, these memories would travel back across the Atlantic, like seeds, ready to take root in German soil. Not all would grow, certainly. Many would fall on hard ground, would be choked by bitterness and denial, but some would find purchase, would send down roots, would eventually blossom into something that looked, improbably, like a different future. This, perhaps, was the final victory of American abundance over Nazi ideology, not won on battlefields, but in camp mess halls, not through weapons, but through the simple act of treating prisoners as human beings, deserving of dignity. It was a victory that proved the power of lived experience over propaganda, the strength of demonstrated values over abstract principles, the remarkable possibility that even in the midst of humanity's darkest chapter, some light could persist, some recognition of shared humanity could survive, some foundation for eventual reconciliation could be laid, one orange at a time.